The 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising was in 1966. I was 14 years old. It was an important occasion in our family because my grandfather, Owen MacNeill, was the head of the Irish Volunteers. He issued last-minute orders to stop his troops from mobilising. Those who ignored his orders and followed Pearse into the GPO were hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered. It was a revolution driven by romance rather than reality, one in which those that died became patriots and those that didn't became prisoners. One young soldier in the Easter Rising was a 25-year-old lad from Cork who was assigned the duty of guarding a stairway here in the GPO which led to the roof. He was committed to the cause, but even more committed to delivering the cause. Not to dying a martyr's death for freedom, but staying alive to achieve that freedom. His name was Michael Collins, and in my view, by any standard, he was Ireland's greatest. Five years after the GPO and the Easter Rising, the British government were offering Ireland a truce, a permanent peace treaty, and then an independent Irish state. None of this would have happened without one man, my man, Michael Collins. Every man wanted to be Michael Collins, and every woman wanted to stand in Kitty Kiernan's shoes. He was Ireland's Scarlet Pimpernel, the man who beat the empire. Maybe it's too easy for the legend to overshadow the man, especially if you're shot down in your prime. But I really believe that there was much that was great about the man they called the Big Fellow. He showed bravery, he showed leadership, he showed genius throughout his short life. He was a man for all seasons, soldier, statesman, diplomat, financier, intelligence supremo. Whatever it took, he gave it in order to achieve his only ambition in life, the freedom of his country. He was Ireland's George Washington. He was our Nelson Mandela. Like so many teenagers of my generation, I grew up in a politicised household in which the name of Michael Collins was revered. He could do no wrong, and, needless to say, his nemesis Eamon de Valera could do no right. I remember reading The Path to Freedom by Michael Collins as a teenager, and the thing is that the more I read about him and the more I found out about him, whatever the myth of Michael Collins, the reality of Michael Collins was even greater. Like many heroes, Collins had modest beginnings. The youngest son of farming parents, he was born in 1890 between Clonakilty and Rosscarbery in West Cork. But by the turn of the century, Ireland was no country for young men, and in time it would be his turn to take the boat. But not before his father had recognised something unique in his youngest child. Michael Collins' father was 70 years of age when Michael was born. And as he lay on his deathbed, he spoke about his 7-year-old son. He said, "One day he'll be a great man. He'll do great work for Ireland." Now, we're all ambitious for our children, but who would have believed that the words of this man spoken on his deathbed in 1897 would turn out to be so true? By 1906, opportunities for bright youngsters were in short supply in West Cork. So when it was his time to go, Michael joined his sister Hanny at the heart of the empire in London. Like so many Irish men and women, Collins emigrated to London at the age of 16. And in the decade that followed, 1912 to 1922, he went from being a lumbering teenager to the powerhouse of Ireland's revolution. That's some decade. This is Blythe House in the centre of the city of London. It was here that Michael Collins joined his sister Hanny to work as a clerk in the post office savings bank. And it was here that he learned key administrative skills, accuracy and attention to detail, which were to serve him so well later on. The post office savings bank was a vast bureaucratic machine at the heart of the empire. Yet ironically, it was helping to train the future IRA head of intelligence who would one day defeat that empire. Young Michael Collins was honing his organisational skills right here in what was then the bank's ledger room and is now the textile store of the Victorian Albert Museum. Actually, he was very lucky to get in here in the first place because he flunked his civil service maths and copying exam. But what he did learn is what every good public servant knows. Keep your head down, don't draw attention to yourself. Know what's going on around you and make yourself indispensable. Because after all, knowledge is power.
Edwardian summer, another world. Yet since the death of Victoria, a world moving along with the spanking pace of the most well-bred of horses.
I think London was where Collins showed an early mark of his greatness, being able to see beyond the two-dimensional caricature of the British Empire. The capital gave him the opportunity to get right inside the belly of the beast. When Collins got to London in 1906, the irony is that it was here in the heart of the empire that his view of the national question took shape. He was preoccupied with Irish freedom. He devoured Davis and Mitchell. He could quote Tynan on the Fenians. He studied Boer War guerrilla tactics. London was a vast library for a budding revolutionary. Collins lived and worked here for 9 years. Ordinary Londoners became his friends, his neighbours and his workmates. He knew what made them tick. He had no argument with them. His argument was with the empire and its masters. But while his head was crammed with big ideas, he was still a teenager. And where else do you go if you're Irish and new in town?
First thing in our heads when we lose the ball, we have to recover it. We still hit the shoulder, lads.
Collins joined the Geraldines GAA club and soon became club secretary. He wasn't a particularly gifted footballer, but he was big, stubborn and competitive. He was a good organiser and a bad loser, and he wore his Irishness on his sleeve. Collins joins the Geraldines at the age of 16 when he comes to London. And by the age of 19, he's club secretary. The club hadn't been doing very well in competition. And in his annual report, Collins noted, "Our internal troubles were saddening, but our efforts in football and hurling were perfectly heartbreaking. In no single contest have our colours been crowned with success."
If he has you fucking hell, don't forget you can stop and change direction.
So even as a teenager here in West London, Collins had no time for underachievement, for slackers or for failure. He was fiercely competitive, and he didn't know when he was beaten. He had guts and passion, and he pushed his teammates to press on even when they were being trounced. And he was prepared to play dirty if he could get away with it. He was the classic team player, not very flash, but lots of heart.
Come on, get the heads up! Come on, Connor, keep working! Let him go!
Collins didn't wait for things to happen.
Okay.
He was going forward. He was more interested in the future than the past.
Over to the star.
His energy and ability soon brought him to the attention of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, for which the GAA was a natural recruiting ground. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, the original Fenians, were a secret army committed to the independent democratic Ireland that Collins dreamed of. For a young rebel looking for a cause, Collins and the IRB were made for each other. The matchmaker in all of this was another post office worker and GAA stalwart, Sam Maguire. Yes, that's Sam Maguire. He was part of a revitalised IRB in London, and he was on the lookout for the next generation of revolutionaries who might succeed where so many had failed before. On the outside, this upmarket design warehouse in Islington seems a million miles away from Michael Collins' London. But it was here in 1909 that he was sworn into the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Although he was only 19 years old, I get the feeling Collins was a man in a hurry, that there was work to be done, progress to be made. Others of his age might have directed their energy into chasing girls or a career, but he channeled it into the struggle for Irish independence. And it was in Barnsbury Hall, right here in this room, that he made it his sworn mission to achieve an Irish Republic. But the republic that Collins was swearing his loyalty to wasn't the Marxist Workers' Republic that James Connolly was advocating at that time. It was the modern democratic Irish Republic that we know and love. What's remarkable about the IRB is how advanced its ideas on democracy were. You have to remember that there were very few examples of what we now call democracy in the world at that time. Voting rights were restricted, government was by an elite, there was little organised public welfare, health or education. So the idea of taking power from the empire and handing it to the people was truly radical. Collins and the IRB put the people at the heart of the republic. Not an ideology, not a dictator, not a king, but the people. And you know, I think this place and this moment was key to Collins' greatness. He wasn't... He was a great man. He never knew when he was beaten, nor did he miss an opportunity to learn from experience. And being a prisoner of war wouldn't change that. First at Stafford Prison and later at Frongoch in North Wales, Collins was a guest of His Majesty's government. Here he made contacts, friends and plans. Like many hundreds of his fellow volunteers, he enrolled in what was to become a Sinn Féin university. And if prison was a college for revolutionaries, Collins was to graduate top of the class. Michael put his time in prison to good use, adding to his contacts, increasing his influence, making people remember his name. By the time of the release and return of prisoners a year later, Collins' star was on the rise. He was put in charge of a welfare fund for veterans and widows of the Rising. The once anonymous post office bank clerk was about to become bagman for the next revolution. And in Ireland, there's nobody as powerful as the man who knows everybody's names, the man who collects the monthly dues, the man who signs the welfare checks. And Collins was all of those men rolled into one. And in addition to that, he was establishing an intelligence network right across Ireland, locating safe houses, appointing messengers, and all of this was personally supervised by him. If you want the job done, give it to a busy man. Collins soon added key positions in the Volunteers, the IRB and Sinn Féin. Found himself a girlfriend, Kitty Kiernan. And when in 1918 Griffith and De Valera were sent back to jail, he found himself rising up the ranks. So now Michael Collins, the big lumbering farmer's son from West Cork, has become the most powerful Republican in the land. If there was one thing he believed in as much as the Republic, it was democracy. The British had repeatedly and heavy-handedly ignored calls for any form of real independence, but surely they couldn't ignore the democratic voice of the people. In 1918, Michael Collins is back here in his native County Cork, but this time standing as a Sinn Féin candidate in the Westminster general election. He wins the South Cork constituency by a landslide, and along with other Sinn Féin MPs, they decide not to take their seats in Westminster, but instead to form a rebel parliament in Dublin, the first Dáil. Winning 2/3 of the available seats, these members of the first Dáil had a mandate, and they were making a dangerously bold statement. They symbolised the democratic wish of the Irish people for independence, and they forced the British to face up to the fact that Ireland now wanted to go it alone. Not that the Empire was in any humour for giving in.
London housed the glorious spectacle of the Victory March. It was the open, honest celebration of a nation happy in its triumph and proud of the men who made it possible.
Emerging victorious from the First World War, in Britain's view, Ireland was still a troublesome little province.
The men have marched into history. the city remains British and proud.
But not for the first time, Collins would put a dent in that pride when he staged one of his most brilliant and audacious operations.
In 1919, Eamon de Valera was in prison in England, and the decision was made to help him escape. Collins personally led a small party of volunteers to spring him from Lincoln Jail. He could have delegated that task to others, but instead he chose to put his life on the line for the movement and for de Valera. It seems to me that that shows that he was an immensely brave man. And if greatness has anything to do with bravery, Michael Collins had it in spades.
The British viewed the First Dáil as a mere upstart, but de Valera, Collins and everybody else in it took it very seriously indeed. If their alternative to Westminster was to succeed, it needed money, lots of it. It fell to the new 29-year-old Minister for Finance to raise that money. The aim was to bring in £500,000, half in Ireland, half overseas. Collins set about raising a bond issue. 1916 veterans, their families, and Dáil TDs, including my grandfather, were among the first subscribers. With funds also flowing in from Eamon de Valera's efforts in America, it soon became a massive success. Collins alone raised £500,000 for the new rebel government.
It's one thing to raise £500,000 for an illegal republic. It's another thing completely to keep it safe and sound. And Collins used all his banking and organisational skills to keep it hidden in accounts across the country. The British government hired a resident magistrate called Alan Bell, and he started to trace where the money was being kept.
Army and police raids began yielding evidence of where the money was going. Within months, Bell was issuing summonses to Collins's bankers. In return, Collins put his newly formed intelligence squad on Alan Bell's tail.
Collins realised he had to act. So Bell was travelling on a tram in Dublin in broad daylight when 3 members of the squad dragged him from the tram and shot him 3 times in the head.
Bell's assassination brought the financial investigation to an end. Shooting him was clinical and ruthless, but if the rebel government was to survive, it was necessary. Soldier, prisoner, politician, and now guerrilla leader and one of the Empire's most wanted men, Collins was always the man the revolution needed him to be.
Take it from me, nobody ever worked as hard for Ireland as Michael Collins did. At the age of 30, he was finance minister, he was chief of intelligence, he was administrative organiser, and all of this while he had a price in his head and was on the run. How's that for greatness? So here we are in Dublin Castle, the seat of British power in Ireland for 800 years. And in Collins' time, this was the place that Ireland was run by the largest empire in the world. And the simple fact about that empire was that it was a master of intelligence. And Collins knew that he couldn't get them out of Ireland if he couldn't beat them at the intelligence game. Knowledge was power. And Collins, by placing his agents and his spies within the castle, was determined to end their knowledge and by doing so to break their power.
The decision to kill Alan Bell, Dublin Castle's financial investigator, was a demonstration of Collins' willingness, tactically and morally, to employ whatever was necessary to achieve the ultimate end, Irish freedom. But Michael Collins believed he had a mandate from the people to achieve that end. His campaign was a new kind of warfare, covert and calculated, ruthless but efficient.
Collins was quite prepared to justify the use of violence in support of political aims, but he didn't believe in the use of violence as an end in itself or in the use of terror. And when it came to eliminating the force of G-men, the British intelligence officers located in this castle, Even in their case, he felt honour-bound to give them a sporting chance, in the sense that he gave them a warning to get the hell out of Ireland.
A small group of highly motivated Dubliners, known as the Squad, carried out Collins's orders. And pubs like Cleary's on Amiens Street were among their safe houses. They came from ordinary working-class communities, and their loyalty to Collins was legendary.
And he had something about him that people took to. You know, the working class, the poor, he seemed to come down to their level. They would have been his eyes and ears, they would have.
There's lots of people that would have done anything for Collins, in particularly in these areas, like, you know.
There's a young lady called Molly O'Reilly, 15 years of age, was carrying guns. She was a local lady. There's 3 generations of her people still drinking the pub.
There must have been a kind of magic about him as a character, because it isn't easy for a fellow from West Cork to come here to the heart of Dublin and to get the whole community working with them.
Well, there had to be, and a great intelligence as well on his part. He knew what he wanted. He had a belief, and he fought for that belief, he did, you know.
Well, the way I look at it, he was a Scarlet Pimpernel.
He was, yeah. Collins had to face up to the moral dimension of what he was doing and what he was asking other people to do. Because although he wasn't pulling the trigger himself, he was in fact asking the lads in the Squad to carry out executions, to kill people in cold blood. And this required tremendous inner moral conviction on his part and the power of persuasion to bring people with them and to persuade them to do things that they really didn't want to do.
Few could resist the challenge or his charisma.
I loved him. I'd have willingly laid down my life for Collins at any time. And I think to me, a cheap price to pay. Without the brains of Collins and his men, we could never have got anywhere.
Collins didn't have it all his own way. There were people in the movement who wanted to confront the British in spectacular pitched battles. The Custom House behind me is the place where it all came to a head. On one afternoon, in a spectacular operation, the records of the British administration were burned to the ground. But the cost to the volunteers was 80 of their members captured. Collins knew that open warfare was not sustainable, and in the end it was his secret warfare strategy that won the day.
Collins's Squad was notorious, Collins himself the most wanted man in the empire. As a unit, they hit and they ran. They harassed and humiliated the British, driving them to the very brink. Before the Custom House debacle, at the height of his secret war, Michael Collins sent his squad out at dawn on a cold Sunday in 1920 to wipe out an entire network of British spies in one fell swoop. But it's the retaliation unleashed that afternoon in Croke Park that is imprinted in Irish history.
British rule in Ireland was beginning to behave like a wounded, dying animal. Faced with a successful guerrilla campaign, their response was to unleash state terror. Burnings, reprisals, arrests, all of this played straight into Collins's hands. Michael Collins' guerrilla war was coming to its end game.
When the bodies of soldiers killed in Ireland began returning to Britain in numbers, there was public outcry. Opinion turned against the war and against the government. Westminster finally took notice. The whole point of Collins' guerrilla war was to force the British to withdraw from Ireland. And he won his point. The Empire called a truce in July 1921.
Collins knew that he hadn't the men and the resources to keep up the struggle indefinitely. And he also knew that one aspect of the truce was that he'd had to bring his secret army and organisation out into the open, to use his own phrase, like rabbits out of their burrows. So he knew very well that once these things had happened, there could be only one outcome, and that was a negotiated settlement.
Eamon de Valera went to Downing Street to see what was on offer. Northern Ireland had already come into existence a year earlier with the Government of Ireland Act, so it was clear that he hadn't a prayer when it came to a 32-county independent republic, or any kind of republic. The only alternatives were a return to war or some form of compromise. Dev simply couldn't be seen to compromise on the ideal of the republic. But Collins was a pragmatist who did whatever Ireland needed whenever she needed it. And what Ireland needed now was a deal, a treaty, because the alternative was a return to a war that Michael Collins knew we couldn't win.
Collins had taken part in 1916. He'd led a secret army. He'd waged war in the British Empire and remained undefeated. But in my view, the bravest thing he did was to get on the boat to go to London for the treaty negotiations. His secret army had emerged from their foxholes. He himself had broken cover. And up to that point, his success had depended on remaining in the shadows. Now Collins was entering the limelight. But was it for the glory, or was it for the blame?
Michael Collins wanted freedom for Ireland as much as anyone, but he knew the British. He hadn't just fought them, he'd lived among them. And now he was back in town, this time looking for independence. But you don't beat an empire in one battle, you take it in stages. For Collins, one stage was over, the next was about to begin.
Westminster, from London's eye, may not seem that imposing, but from ground level it dominates London, just as London dominated the empire. Michael Collins' guerrilla war broke that dominance and allowed the Irish to look the British as equals in the eye. And let's look at what Arthur Griffith had to say about Collins. He said, "Michael Collins won the war. He's the man, and no one knows it better than I do, whose matchless energy and indomitable will carried Ireland through the years of terror. Michael Collins beat the black and tan terror until England was forced to offer terms of peace."
The rest of the Irish negotiating team, Griffith, Barton, Duggan and Gavin Duffy, headed to Hand's place in London ahead of Collins, who was busy getting engaged to Kitty Kiernan. But when Michael arrived independently in London a day later, there was nothing nostalgic about his return to a city he knew well. This time he knew he was about to enter the lion's den.
Collins and his team stayed here at 15 Cadogan Gardens, now an exclusive primary school which numbers Prince Charles among its former pupils. Collins may have been negotiating a peace treaty, but he also remained the head of the IRB and director of intelligence. He needed privacy. He needed to stay in touch with his communications network. And above all, he needed to keep his options open in case the negotiations broke down.
But he was committed to negotiate, and Michael Collins was about to show the same flair for talking as he had for fighting. This was the international news story of the day, and everyone wanted a part of its leading Irish player.
Sir John Lavery painted a portrait of Michael Collins during the treaty negotiations in London in 1921. Some say his wife, Hazel, succumbed to Collins' charms. Collins had charisma, but in London he was developing the status of a Hollywood movie star. The elusive Irish Pimpernel was freely walking the streets of the Empire's capital.
For better or worse, he was now out in the open.
Well, I mentioned that Collins wanted privacy here in Cadogan Gardens, but it wasn't just privacy to carry on his functions in the IRB and the like. He was also seeking privacy from what was an emerging celebrity status as far as Collins was concerned. And there are some indications of this in his letters back and forward between himself and Kitty Kiernan. It's very interesting to see that at one stage he says, "How's London? Met any nice girls that you liked? Did you kiss anybody since? I didn't get the chance. You know I'm only joking." But later on she writes, "A girlfriend told me that a man in Dublin told her that a girlfriend of his heard from a society woman in London that her only idea in life now is to get to spend a night with Michael Collins. She's satisfied with just one night, just for the notoriety of it. Now there's a little bit of edge creeping into his relationship with Kitty. But celebrity status was also bringing another pressure on Collins. Newspaper owners, book publishers, even movie producers were now vying with each other to offer him huge sums for the exclusive right to the Collins story.
From the broad canvas of newsreel reporting, we turn to the intimate studies of great figures in history.
If there'd been a celebrity magazine at the time, Collins would have had the front page. But there was no glamour in what he was here to do. He was here to cut a deal for Ireland, and he wouldn't leave until it was done.
What's that?
10 years earlier, Collins had been hurling on the fields of Perryvale in West London. Now he was joint head of a delegation confronting the lions of the British Empire, David Lloyd George, Winston Churchill and Lord Birkenhead. Griffith was the brains of the operation, but Collins was its powerhouse and its personality.
Collins and the other delegates found themselves starting a game already 2 goals down. As far as the British were concerned, a united Ireland was out. An independent Irish Republic was also out. What was on offer was Dominion status, similar to Canada, independence, but within the British Commonwealth. Collins, the great revolutionary, the great guerrilla leader, had to become Ireland's greatest diplomat, and quickly.
Collins, by turns, charmed, infuriated, but impressed the British. The Cabinet Secretary, Tom Jones, wrote, "The tenacity of the IRA is extraordinary. Where was Michael Collins during the Great War? He would have been worth a dozen brass hats. I'm sure the Prime Minister has a secret admiration for him. He'll be canonised someday."
The truth is, Collins was now fighting on 2 fronts. In London, he was going face to face with Empire heavyweights like Lloyd George and Churchill. Back in Dublin, hardliners like Cathal Brugha and Austin Stack were threatening to split the cabinet by demanding total separation from the British Crown. As the storm clouds gathered, Collins, Griffith and the team needed all their skills to keep any hope of independence alive.
Well, as somebody who's crossed that door on many occasions on behalf of the Irish people in their dealings with the British government, I think I have some insight into the minds of Griffith and Collins. But the circumstances were very different. These were inexperienced people dealing with the mightiest empire on earth. And in that context, their achievement is all the more remarkable because they pulled off what was their goal, the creation of an independent Irish state.
On December 6th, 1921, the deal was done. With no further room for manoeuvre, and Lloyd George threatening the resumption of an immediate and terrible war, Michael Collins and the Irish delegation put their signatures to the Anglo-Irish Treaty.
After years of bloodshed, a treaty was signed, and in Dublin, a new flag replaced the Union Jack.
Now, I've put my name to many documents in my time, but nothing compares to the hastily typed sheaf of papers signed in London that day in 1921. The Irish copy of the treaty is now in the care of the National Archives, and curator Tom Quinlan has arranged a rare privilege. I'm being allowed view this remarkable document.
Seeing the original that normally the public doesn't get to see.
It's amazing. It's fantastic. This is, to me, the foundation document of the independent Ireland. Wow. On behalf of the Irish delegation, on behalf of the British delegation, that's absolutely amazing. Lloyd George, Chamberlain, Birkenhead, and Winston Churchill, the victors of the First World War, and on the other hand, Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, Robert Barton, Duggan, and Gavin Duffy.
Every treaty involves compromise, and this was no different. But with their signatures, the course of Irish history would change forever. And I think we should be grateful for their courage.
There must have been self-doubt. There must have been anxiety. There must have been an internal questioning. If I do this right now, am I delivering to Ireland what the Irish people will accept and what they want, or am I letting them down? And that's what statesmanship is all about. That's what politics is all about. And politics is a mix sometimes of personal ambition, the will to survive politically, and the will to do the best you can for your country. And in those few seconds, when he was lowering his pen to that paper, all of those thoughts must have been going through Collins's mind. Because when Birkenhead immediately said after he had signed it, "This may be my political death warrant," Collins immediately, across the table in Downing Street, retorted, "It may be my personal death warrant."
In Dublin, the split was underway. The IRB endorsed the treaty, but De Valera and his supporters rejected it. Undaunted, Collins and Griffith took the democratic route, and they put the case for peace directly to the people's representatives in the Dáil.
Dáil Éireann used to meet in the Mansion House, but in December 1921, it had been pre-booked for a Christmas fair. So instead it met in this room, in what was then UCD and is now part of the National Concert Hall. In London, Collins had been in a no-win situation, but it was a situation which demanded a decision. He was no poet, no dreamer, no idealist. Above all, he was a pragmatist and a reluctant politician. De Valera was angry, but Michael Collins was determined to stand up his decision and to stand over it.
On Monday, the 19th of December 1921, Michael Collins made one of the greatest Irish political speeches of all time, one that he would then take around the country and put in print. He rejected utterly the notion that he and the other signatories had exceeded their mandate. They certainly weren't bullied into signing the treaty by the British. And he reiterated eloquently his belief that the treaty was simply a stepping stone, a means to an end, when he said, "I do not recommend it for more than it is. Equally, I do not recommend it for less than it is. In my opinion, it gives us freedom. Not the ultimate freedom that all nations desire and develop to, but the freedom to achieve it."
The country was deeply divided between those who supported the treaty and those who wanted to reject it. Ireland was on the edge of civil war. For Michael Collins, there was only one way forward. Ask the people. They alone had the right to decide the issue.
De Valera had resigned and Michael Collins was the head of the provisional government. That June, in the general election, effectively a referendum on the treaty, the people gave Collins an overwhelming endorsement.
Ireland, save the 6 counties of Ulster, had become the Irish Free State. Down came the barriers and barbed wire so long associated with British rule, and the Crown's forces marched out for good.
After 700 years, it was Michael Collins who began closing the door on British occupation. Now it was their turn to take the boat. The Irish were back in charge of their own destiny. But just as he had ended one war, another was looming. There were 2 armies in the state. One, the anti-treaty IRA, claiming to be the legitimate army of the Republic that wasn't to be. The other, Collins's National Army, the army of the new Free State. Former comrades, neighbours, brothers, sons and daughters now found themselves on opposing sides. Everything Michael Collins had devoted his life to was beginning to unravel. An anti-treaty garrison barricaded in the forecourts had been tolerated by Collins for months, as he made desperate behind-the-scenes efforts to reconcile old comrades. But with no compromise likely, Collins was balancing old loyalties with new democracy. Something had to give. The rebels kidnapped a Free State general. Then, rightly or not, they were also blamed for the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson in London. The British gave Collins an ultimatum: to get the IRA out of the forecourts, or they would.
So faced with this dilemma, he made the tough decision, and that was to clear the forecourts garrison himself. And at the bottom of all this lay a fundamental dilemma and a decision for Collins to make.
Did he allow Ireland to become the private property of IRA hardliners who didn't accept the capacity of the Irish people to decide the issue of the treaty for themselves?
Or did he uphold the authority of the government, the deal he'd done with the British, and the right of the Irish people to decide all of these issues through the ballot box?
Although brief, the 11-month civil war was bloody, bitter, and left scars that would take generations to heal. Ireland began tearing itself apart. Owen MacNeill's sons, my uncles, took opposing sides. One of them, Brian MacNeill, sided against the treaty and was killed in a running battle in Sligo. Collins had also lost friends and comrades during the Civil War. His old pal, Harry Boland, who took the anti-treaty side, was shot dead on the 31st of July. And within 2 weeks, his treaty colleague and Dáil president, Arthur Griffith, died suddenly. Only days ahead of an even bigger funeral, Michael Collins led the Griffith cortege to Glasnevin, the final resting place for Ireland's greatest heroes. I have no doubt but that Collins desperately wanted to end this conflict. Later that month he returned to his beloved West Cork to visit his troops, but perhaps also to find some way to get through to the other side.
On the 22nd of August 1922, Collins and his party stopped here to ask for directions in the pub behind me, which is then called Long's Bar. Little did they know that the bar was then owned by the intelligence officer of the local anti-treaty forces. And so events were set in train that would lead to Collins' death a few hundred yards from here later that evening.
His father had predicted great things for Michael Collins, but it was a single bullet in a scrappy skirmish on a quiet back road that killed him.
They say that those who the gods love die young, and heroes often come to a tragic end. Michael Collins could have died in the 1916 Rising. He could have been gunned down by the G-men who hunted him across Ireland. He could have been assassinated at a great public event surrounding the treaty controversy. But instead, his death came here on a lonely country road in southwest Cork on the 22nd of August 1922. And with his death, Collins moved from history to legend.
From the ashes of the GPO just 6 years earlier, Michael Collins had blazed his way from obscurity to national hero. His death left the country dumbstruck. In the way that only the greatest can, he had captured the imagination and the hearts of the Irish people.
he was 2 months short of his 32nd birthday.
So here we are at the last grave that we'll visit on the tour, and it's the final resting place of Michael Collins. As you can see by it, it's the most popular grave in the cemetery today. Every day of the year, people put flowers on his grave. I remember reading a book once, and it said if you want to be a hero, you need to be 5 things. You need to be young, charismatic, good-looking, intelligent, and dead. His epitaph is simplicity itself. It just says, "Here lies Michael Collins. May God give everlasting peace to his soul." So, the last resting place of Michael Collins.
In 1937, Ireland adopted its present form of Republican Constitution, and in 1948, we left the British Commonwealth. Collins never lived to see these events, but the men and women who achieved them for Ireland stood on his shoulders, and our modern Irish democracy is built on the foundations that Collins laid.
Perhaps the most unlikely yet poignant tribute was eventually paid to him by his fellow patriot and rival, Eamon de Valera. He's claimed to have said, "In the fullness of time, history will record the greatness of Collins, and it will be recorded at my expense." Eventually, Eamon de Valera parted with the hardliners and dedicated himself to developing the democratic ideals which Michael Collins fought and died for.
Michael Collins planned for, fought for, and secured the independence of this country. And if our freedom is his greatest achievement, then perhaps our democracy is his legacy. Because in the last analysis, we the people decide every important issue through the ballot box. And no minority, no ideology, and no threat of violence can stand in our way. This is our republic, and we have Michael Collins to thank for that.
If you agree with Michael McDowell and want to vote for Michael Collins as Ireland's greatest, call 1513 71 7101 or text GREAT followed by the number 1 to 53125. Viewers in Northern Ireland can also text 53125 or call the number on screen. Or you can vote now for Bono, James Connolly, John Hume or Mary Robinson using their vote numbers on screen. Full details are on RTE Airtel page 197 and online at rte.ie/Ireland's Greatest. Voting will close during the Late Late Show on Friday the 22nd of October when the final results will also be revealed.
And next week, Dave Fanning champions Bono to hit the list of Ireland's greatest here on One. On the way now, it's the Frontline and more details on that in just a few moments.